What's going on, everyone? We got a lot to get into today, so let's get started. Beginning with what Al Jazeera is calling a massacre in Gaza overnight. They say massacre. Dozens killed by Israeli fire in Gaza while collecting food aid. We do have a series of conflicting reports here. According to Al Jazeera, they say dozens of Palestinians have been killed and more than 700 others wounded after Israeli troops opened fire on hundreds waiting for food aid southwest of Gaza City, with the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemning what they said was a cold-blooded massacre. Reporting from the scene, Al Jazeera's Ismail Al-Ghul said that after opening fire, Israeli tanks advanced and ran over many of the dead and injured bodies, saying, quote, "It is a massacre, on top of the starvation threatening citizens of Gaza." And then according to one Palestinian man, he said, quote, "I have been waiting since yesterday. At about 4:30 this morning, trucks started to come through. Once we approached the aid trucks, the Israeli tanks and warplanes started firing at us as if it was a trap." Then we do have a response from Israel as reported by Manny Fabian. He says, according to an initial IDF probe of the crowd crush in northern Gaza, the vast majority of the casualties were a result of trampling and being struck by the aid trucks. He said the incident began at around 4 a.m. when some 30 trucks carrying humanitarian aid arrived at the coast of Gaza City to deliver food to the Palestinians. He said thousands of Palestinians rushed the trucks after they passed an IDF checkpoint in central Gaza, leading to a stampede in which dozens of Palestinians were wounded and killed, some after being run over by the trucks. He says the IDF's initial investigation finds that some of the trucks managed to continue further north, where armed men reportedly opened fire at the convoy and looted it. He says dozens of Palestinians who rushed the last truck in the convoy began to move towards an IDF tank and troops stationed at a nearby checkpoint. An IDF officer stationed in the area ordered his troops to fire warning shots in the air as the Palestinians were within a few dozen meters, as well as gunfire at the legs of those who continued to move forward towards the troops. So the IDF has coordinated several aid deliveries to northern Gaza in recent weeks, although this one was larger than usual, and it will now look to finding a solution to prevent such incidents from happening in the future. Now, the starvation in Gaza right now is a very real thing. We're starting to hear more and more about that. UN officials say that at least 1/4 of Gaza's current population, more than 576,000 people total, are one step away from famine, and virtually the entire population desperately needs food, resulting in some aid trucks being shot at, looted, and overwhelmed by the hungry population. According to a UN official, he said that an additional 1/4 of Gaza's population is close to famine, and 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza are suffering from acute malnutrition and wasting, where the body becomes emaciated. Carl Scow, a deputy executive director of the World Food Program, said that, quote, "This is the worst level of child malnutrition anywhere in the world," and he warned that if nothing happens, a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. Now, an interesting note coming out of the U.S. administration yesterday, the Biden administration gave Israel until mid-March to sign a letter provided by the United States on Tuesday that gives assurances that it will abide by international law while using U.S. weapons and allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, this has to do with a national security memorandum that was published on February 8th that states before supplying somebody, any country, with U.S. weapons, that country must give credible and reliable written assurances that it will use such weapons in accordance with international humanitarian law. It also stresses that a country that uses weapons in a conflict area needs to provide, quote, "credible and reliable written assurances that it will facilitate and not arbitrarily deny, restrict, or otherwise impede directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance and United States government-supported international efforts to provide humanitarian assistance." According to this memorandum, countries engaged in ongoing conflicts like Israel have 45 days from the date that the memo was issued to provide the written assurances and have them certified by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Other countries not engaged in an active war have 180 days. So a little bit of context here that I thought might be helpful because I could see this being presented in somewhat of a skewed manner. The 45-day window there is not a lot of time. It might sound like it because we're asking these countries that are like Israel actively engaged in a war to say, make sure you use our weapons in accordance with international humanitarian law. And you would hope that every one of them could check that box right away and say, we don't even need to look into anything. Of course, we're abiding by international law. But the nature, unfortunately, the bureaucratic nature of agreements or memorandums going back and forth between countries on the world stage, it takes a long long time. The nuance of digging into the agreement and the text to understand what it means now and going forward, what a country agrees to provide or not provide, and in what context, there's a lot to that, unfortunately. So 45 days, actually, in this case, is, all things considered, a pretty quick turnaround. Then earlier this week, there's a notable election in Michigan with rather unique results. So according to the BBC, they say Michigan voters have sent a clear warning to the White House that Joe Biden's support for Israel's war in Gaza could cost him dearly in the presidential election in November. They say more than 100,000 voters marked a box for uncommitted as a protest in Tuesday's Democratic primary. They note that Biden is still the clear Democratic frontrunner by quite a bit. But if all of those votes, those 100,000, go against him or even just sit this election out, it could have a very big impact on the overall results. So as an example, Hillary Clinton back in 2016 lost Michigan to former President Trump by less than 11,000 votes. So again, 100,000 selected uncommitted, and back in 2016, the state was determined by less than 11,000 total votes. Then Layla Alabed, manager of the Listen to Michigan campaign, said, quote, "If Biden doesn't act now and listen to the 80% of Democrats and the 66% of Americans that want a permanent ceasefire right now, it is going to be Biden, his administration, and the Democratic Party that are going to be accountable for handing the White House to Trump in November." Now, I'm not a political analyst, so take this with a grain of salt, but a personal opinion here, outside looking in, is it seems to me like these protest voters are kind of walking a tightrope. It's not entirely clear what the goal outcome is here. And the reason I say that is if you look at Trump and Biden, their Israel policy, Trump is arguably more pro-Israel than Biden. So it's entirely accurate what Alabed says here based off of these votes, that if this number of people sit out or change their vote in November, it could mean that Michigan goes to Trump. And that could have an impact on the overall election, swaying the result towards a Trump victory. However, that doesn't really change the policy that the United States has towards Israel. So it's a protest vote against Biden and his handling of this war, but in doing so, it might put somebody into office who's even more pro-Israel. So again, not a political analyst. That's just what it looks like from my perspective. We'll see what that plan looks like as we get closer to the general election. Now, we do have some new poll results coming out of a Harvard Caps Harris poll showing how American feelings have changed around this war since October. One question that was consistent, and has been consistently asked month over month, is in this conflict, who do you support more, Israel or Hamas? In the February poll, 82% said Israel, 18% said Hamas. Now, that's actually a bit of a change where in October, it was 84% for Israel and 16% for Hamas. And I think this kind of poll, the way that this is asked, can get confusing at times. This question here is being asked about the two entities at war, Israel and Hamas. There are other polls out there asking about who do your sympathies lie more with, the Israeli or the Palestinian people. But in this case, they're looking at the two parties actively engaged in the ongoing conflict. Then when asked about a ceasefire, 67% said that a ceasefire should only happen after the release of all hostages and Hamas being removed from power, while 33% said they favor an unconditional ceasefire that would leave everyone in place. Now, I've said it before, and it's personal opinion here, but I think this type of question is more indicative of how Americans feel around this whole ceasefire subject. So generally we hear that 60+% of Americans support a ceasefire, but I'm not sure that paints the whole picture. You know, a ceasefire with the return of hostages and the removal of Hamas is very different than a ceasefire where Hamas stays in power and the hostages are not returned. So I like how this one was asked, and according to this poll, it's 67% of Americans that do support a ceasefire so long as those hostages come home and Hamas is no longer in power. Now, we've seen a notable decrease of attacks against U.S. forces across the Middle East in recent weeks. To give you a bit of a timeline here, going back to February 2nd, that's when the United States carried out a wave of strikes against Iran-backed militias across Iraq and Syria. Then on February 7th, the Kataib Hezbollah director of operations, Abu Bakr al-Saidi, was killed in a Baghdad strike. So again, looking at the timeline here, in the week leading up to the U.S. strikes on February 2nd, there were 12 attacks claimed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq. 12 attacks in 7 days leading up to that first wave of U.S. strikes. After that first wave of strikes and before the strike killing Saidi, there were 3 attacks claimed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq. So already seen a bit of a downtick. Since Saidi was killed in Baghdad, zero 0 attacks claimed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq over the course of the last 3 weeks, which is the longest stretch that we've gone since these really spiked in mid-October following the Hamas attack into Israel. Now, it's worth noting there have been 3 attacks claimed by a group called the Jihad Brothers. Not entirely clear who these guys are. I think there might be a link there between them and the Muslim Brotherhood, but there's no confirmation by the United States of any of these attacks taking place, and none of those were claimed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq. Then we do have some possible news about a ceasefire, although the details are pretty murky at this point, and the two sides are pretty skittish about whether or not this will actually play out. According to Al Jazeera, they say 400 Palestinian prisoners are to be released, including those serving life sentences, in exchange for the release of 40 Israeli abductees from among the women and adults. They say Israel will allow a gradual return to the northern Gaza Strip of Gazans who are not of military service age. Israel will make it possible to increase aid to the Gaza Strip, as well as temporary housing solutions alongside heavy engineering equipment to rebuild portions of Gaza. They say Israeli forces will be redeployed outside of the populated areas of the Strip, and Israel will prevent aerial activity in the Gaza Strip for 8 hours a day. Not entirely clear that this is actually coming to fruition. A senior Hamas official kind of tamped down on this, saying there was no agreement on this deal out of Paris, that Israel did not accept the American offer, and that the sole purpose of anything being pushed forward in Paris was for Netanyahu to buy more time to organize a new military operation, likely aimed towards Rafah in the southern portion of the Gaza Strip. They doubled down here, saying that Hamas's demands include a final and total ceasefire, not just a humanitarian pause, the total withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and freedom of movement for Palestinians throughout the Gaza Strip. So again, for the last couple weeks, we've seen a lot of talk about the possibility of a relatively long ceasefire in Gaza. Some proposals I've seen push this out to 10 weeks. But while all of this has been going on and the various leaks hitting the media outlets, you have officials from Hamas and Israel both continuing to draw hard lines in the sand. For Israel saying they, no matter what, will eliminate the military capabilities of Hamas. They will return all hostages and will ensure that the security situation is under control in Gaza. And then from the Hamas perspective, they want all of the Israeli troops out of Gaza and a permanent, total ceasefire. They're still very much at odds over the core tenets of what a ceasefire agreement could look like. Then turning down to Yemen, on February 26th, the U.S. Central Command said they destroyed 3 unmanned surface vessels, 2 mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, and a one-way attack drone in self-defense. They say these were prepared to launch towards assets in the Red Sea. Then on February 27th, U.S. aircraft and a coalition warship shot down 5 Iranian-backed Houthi one-way attack drones, also in the Red Sea. These were confirmed by the Houthis, saying that they targeted an American destroyer in the Red Sea with a number of drones. Now, the big strike that the Houthis carried out recently was against the Belize-flagged Ruby Mar on February 18th, where those 24 crew members were forced to abandon ship the day of the attack. That crew was made up of people from Syria, Egypt, India, and the Philippines. They were rescued by the Djibouti Port Authority. Now, it sounds like the Ruby Mar is still afloat. The Houthis have claimed a couple times now that it has sunk. It is sinking. We've seen some pictures of it taking on a significant amount of water, but there is a process underway to try to salvage it. The ship's owner, the Blue Fleet Group, told Sky News that the U.S. Navy has offered to help tow the vessel to the nearest port that would accept it, but added that the negotiations are ongoing. Those negotiations are tied to a couple key aspects here. There appears to be a small fuel leakage that they're trying to fix before towing this in any direction. And it's also rumored that the Ruby Mar is carrying 22,000 tons of fertilizer that could be considered volatile. Then Israel released a series of videos this last week showing significant Hamas tunnels that they uncovered in central and northern Gaza, some of which they say passes under a hospital and a university. The IDF says the tunnel network, which is more than 10 kilometers long, which is pretty significant, passes under the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital and a nearby university, and reaches as far as the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza City. According to the IDF, the tunnel here was used by Hamas's Gaza City and Central Camps brigades to move fighters and weapons between the two areas. The IDF also says that it discovered living quarters, bathrooms, and weapons depots in the tunnels, as well as the bodies of several Hamas operatives that were killed in the fighting and left behind as other forces evacuated the area. We also have some footage here showing the tunnel entrances alongside the hospital and the university complexes taken from overhead footage. Then this past Sunday, Aaron Bushnell, an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, has died. after setting himself on fire outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., while declaring that he will, quote, no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm going to leave it at that for now. It's already sounding like there's some unique aspects to this story that I think the best course of action here is to acknowledge that it happened, but wait for additional information to come out before discussing this any further. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out the work we're doing on Substack. Link is in the description below. Substack is essentially a combination of a website and a newsletter. We're publishing videos, audio recordings of these articles, and then new articles talking about China's little blue men in the South China Sea. We've got drug smuggling in Ecuador, Ukraine targeting Russian forces in Sudan. It's a wide range of subjects that I think are complementary to what I'm talking about in these videos. Again, that's all linked in the description below. Hope you'll check it out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.